Life in New York City involves its share of peculiarities. Why do we call Houston Street Houston Street? How come there are so many original raised pizzas? And why do some bridges have hefty tolls when some aren't tolled at all? A movement is underway to address that last quirk and to shore up our mass transit system at the same time. It's called Move New York, and it's gaining more support than previous efforts to change tolls and help transit, but it's still got a way to go. Let's learn a little more about the idea and its chances of becoming a reality from Alec Matthiessen, the Move New York campaign director and president of Blue Marble Project. Welcome back to BK Live, Alex.
Sure.
Masha Burina, the community organizer at Riders Alliance. Thanks very much for coming on, Masha. And Alec Slatsky, legislative and community relations representative for AAA Northeast. Good afternoon, Alec. So, Move New York, what is it?
Essentially, it's a proposal to create a fair tolling system in the city of New York where we lower dramatically by almost 50% tolls in the outer parts of the city where people don't have good transit options, they're not causing congestion. On average, they're less wealthy. And we restore tolls on the 4 East River bridges as well as across 60th Street to make sure there's parity in the tolling system. What that does is not only greatly reduce the amount of traffic inside the central business district of New York City as well as in the communities in Brooklyn and Queens and Upper Manhattan around it, but it also unleashes an enormous amount of revenue that we can use to then plow back into not just the transit system, but also the city's roads and bridges. Thanks to our work with AAA, which began 4 years ago, and others, we have understood the importance that if you're going to be paying more tolls, some of that money has to go back into maintaining and improving our roads and bridges. On the transit side, it's about $1 billion a year in new revenue that goes into our transit system. It's not only going to help the MTA fill its budget gap to do the things that it feels that are important to do, but really importantly and very distinct in this plan from previous efforts is we create something called a Transit Gap Investment Fund. And that's a $4.5 billion fund that will be managed by elected officials, borough presidents, and working with their constituents and the MTA and New York City DOT to identify those many areas of the city in the outer parts of the city, South Brooklyn, Eastern Queens, Staten Island, Eastern Bronx, which still don't have good transit service. This is going to be an effort and a big pot of money to be able to start making investments in those communities so that they too have good transit options.
Masha, the Riders Alliance, what's your position on this? Do you like this plan?
Yeah, we think it's a great plan. One of the reasons is that every day for a round trip, subway and bus riders are paying over $5. So they're investing in the mass transit system. But what we've seen today, because of record high ridership numbers, overcrowding, record numbers of delays, is that we need real investments in mass transit now. And we find that Move New York Fair Plan is a really sustainable way to invest in mass transit.
So, Alec, you represent those of us foolish or brave enough to actually drive in and around the metro area. What do you think of this idea?
So it would have been hard for us 7 or 8 years ago to sit here at this table and give any sort of praise whatsoever to any sort of tolling plan. It would have been unheard of. And now we're not necessarily 100% supportive, but we absolutely think the plan deserves consideration. And I think the reason is if you started from scratch, you wouldn't design the toll system the way it is now. That has to do with history, politics, bureaucracy, all the quirks that you mentioned at the top of the show. But it definitely is true, as Alex said, that outer borough drivers on the Verrazano, on the Throgs Neck Whitestone, they've been getting screwed for a long, long time. And just in 2016, they're projecting about a $1 billion a $1.1 billion surplus in revenue, and $680 million is going to be funding transit. Now, people from the Queens to the Bronx, they have 2 bus routes over the Whitestone Bridge. That's it. If you want to go there, you don't really have a transit option. And so that it's not fair, as Alex said, for those people to be subsidizing the transit system, in our opinion.
What gives you pause? Why aren't you 100% behind this plan as it stands now?
I mean, the reality is we're never going to be enamored with putting tolls on the East River bridges. We're never going to be enamored with putting a toll at 60th Street. And we know for someone who drives, let's say, over the Queensboro Bridge every day, we might be adding an extra $2,700 to their commute. And that's a significant pot of money. And I'm not willing to say that everyone that does that is a rich fat cat. But at the same time, we recognize the people driving over the Whitestone. My colleagues commuting from the Bronx and Westchester to Mineola on Long Island, they're going to save $1,200 a year. So there are absolutely pros and cons. It's unusual for us because normally we represent drivers as a class, and now there are definitely different classes of drivers in this plan.
So back in my youth of 2008, I recall a plan called congestion pricing, which sounds quite a bit like this one. What's different about this plan from congestion pricing?
There's some major differences. I mean, the similarities are that, like that plan, we're proposing to restore tolls on the East River bridges. Remember, all 4 of those bridges were tolled originally when they were built, a long time ago, and across 60th Street as well. By the way, it's all electronic tolling, so it's flow-through tolling. There's no toll gates, no toll booths, et cetera. So you just
and those who don't have
right
Easy Pass use the optical.
Basically, at this point, a little photograph would be taken of their license plate. They get a bill in the mail, and they just pay it by that. But by the time this actually were implemented, which would be a couple of years from now, 2018 or 19, it's quite possible that your GPS or your smartphone could be an alternative way of paying. But the bottom line is the major differences are, first, and again, this is because Sam Schwartz and I reached out to AAA a long time ago, because Sam's idea was, we've got to go first to the opponents of past plans and ask them what the problems were and see if we can address those problems. And AAA was, I think, very pleased to even have a chance to sit and talk with us, because they, I think, frankly, hadn't been consulted the last time. And as I like to put it, even today, I say, under previous plans, drivers are being asked to pay new tolls, and 100 cents on every dollar in new tolls would have gone into the transit system, and that's just not a fair deal. So again, one of the major differences is that a quarter of the revenue raised each year, which is about $375 million a year, goes into a first ever dedicated road and bridge fund. That's good news for drivers. Alec rightly pointed out that obviously for some drivers who have gotten used to this free bridge and they use it regularly, there's going to be an additional cost to taking that bridge from now on if we pass this plan. On the other hand, if you think about the cost of maintaining your car and repairing your car because you're slamming into potholes all the time is also substantial, and I think drivers understand that too. One thing I should also add is that this plan will include a variable toll. So that means that it will be a little higher during the peak hours when people are going at the peak of congestion, but in the off hours, evenings, overnight, weekends, the toll can be much lower. So it's quite possible that $2,700 could be a lot less depending on what their time of day travel is. The second big difference, again, is that we're providing huge toll relief on 7 major and minor bridges in the outer parts of the city. Again, drivers didn't get that benefit. The third difference is that we're speeding up travel by a lot more than the Bloomberg plan would have, by almost 20% inside the CBD and 5 to 8% outside the CBD. That means you get to work faster, you miss that meeting less often, et cetera.
So where are we on the politics of getting this passed? I mean, I think last week it was reported that 8 additional Assembly members have come on board, but the problem probably isn't in the Assembly, right?
I would actually rather defer to Alex on this matter, but we do see from our sort of member base, which is constituents that are dependent on mass transit, subway and bus riders, they're largely in favor of this. And really they're trying to get the attention from their elected officials to support Move New York this session.
Yeah, I think, Jarrett, we have a lot of momentum. As you say, we now have 23 sponsors in the Assembly, and I think there's a large number of Assembly members who are just waiting for things to move a little bit further before they come out and make their position public. But I think we have a lot more support, latent support there in the Assembly. And I'm quite hopeful that very soon we're going to be introducing a Senate bill, and I feel quite confident in that. And so once you've got a 2-House bill, then I think this thing becomes very real, and a debate at least will happen and take place, which is, I think, as Alex said, we should at least have a debate on it. Let's have that conversation, and I think we very well could have a vote on this this year, possibly next year, but maybe even as soon as by the end of session this year.
Since we're on BK Live, I have to ask, Brooklyn's elected officials, where have they come down on this so far? Have any of them come out with a position for or against?
Yeah, there we have probably, I'd say, in the Assembly we have, I think, 4 or 5 co-sponsors of the bill from across Brooklyn. And then I think if you also include the Senate and the City Council, we probably have another dozen. So we've got strong support in Brooklyn. And again, as Masha said, we're doing work to grow that list. We want more support, obviously, before we get to a voting situation, but we think the support is there.
Masha, do you think that the MTA's capital plan is massive, and as far as I know, a lot of what's going to fund it over the next 5 to 10 years is still kind of a question mark? The revenue from this plan, does it solve that problem, or is it part of the solution to that problem?
It's definitely a major part of the solution to the problem. I mean, right now what we've seen and we have is a 2015-2019 capital plan that has yet to be approved in Albany, partly because they're having challenges figuring out exactly how to fund it. So this proposal, Move New York, would really be able to identify over $1 billion annually that would be able to go towards fixing, improving, and expanding the network of subway and buses.
And Alec, do you think that, do drivers care about mass transit? I mean, are we at the point now where everyone sort of feels like they have a vested interest in shoring up that system, or are they really separate constituencies?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of our members, most of our members are multimodal, right? They're driving their cars, they're taking the subway or bus or commuter rail. And I think that's true of a lot of people, even those that rely primarily on the subway. Some of them might drive their car from time to time or rent a car. So I think we're becoming an increasingly multimodal city. So absolutely, I think drivers care about transit, but as Alex said, they probably care first and foremost about making sure their roads are okay. And I mean, I think there is some political risk for this plan, including for ourselves. Mm-hmm. But the main issue, in my mind, is not necessarily how radical this plan is, how big of a change it is. It's the public relations problem with tolls in general. We're in a lawsuit against the Port Authority. We've been in a lawsuit for 4.5 years over what we allege is that they're using interstate toll revenues to fund the Pulaski Skyway, which is a New Jersey-owned road, and the World Trade Center. And whenever we get in the news, we get a call from a member or a concerned citizen and said, "You guys are doing great work. Thank God you're suing the jerks at the MTA." It was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. We're not suing the MTA. It's not the DOT, it's the Port Authority. And so we're trying to educate our members about who controls what, because it is confusing to a driver. You drive over a road, you're going from Long Island to New Jersey. You might be going over a town road, a village road, a county road, a city road, a state road, MTA, Port Authority. So there's a lot of confusion about the jurisdiction, and tolls in general, I think, have a PR problem because of that reason. Everything we've seen with Bridgegate is not really related, but it casts aspersion on tolling authorities in general. And most of our members, when we ask them, do you support the Move New York plan? If so, if not, why not? The ones who say they don't say, by and large, they're worried the money is going to be diverted. And I know there's bonding that will go into the plan, so that is a level of safeguarding. But even with that, there's still a bit of skepticism from what we've seen with the Port Authority that if they really wanted to get around it, maybe they could. And that you want to make sure for the roads and bridges, that's additional revenue. You're not robbing Peter to pay Paul. You keep the existing streams of revenue.
Let's talk about the skepticism, because I want to address that. You're getting more support in the Assembly, but the state Senate, and I know the governor, I think, has kind of hedged his bets. I don't know where the mayor comes down. Where do the other sort of powers that be come down on this so far, and how do you get them to come to your side?
I would say, I think the mayor is very open to it. The deputy mayor did send a letter to the MTA last summer saying, we want to work with you to figure out how to close this budget gap, and we think that one of the proposals you should consider is the Move New York plan. So I think there's openness in City Hall to this. But this is ultimately going to be decided by the state legislature, and so that's kind of where the focus is. I think the governor has been very clear both in his private and public statements, which is, I think he's said on record, I think the plan has merit, but he's also been very careful to say, the politics are very difficult. It didn't work out last time. I haven't seen so far those politics changing. The message we get from that is it's up to you guys. It's incumbent upon you guys to show us that there's a political path here. So that means we've got to show that there's support in the Assembly and the Senate. If we can show that, then I think the governor will take a hard look at this.
And how does the Riders Alliance help to do that? How do you guys make the case for this plan? I mean, I think most New Yorkers probably still haven't heard about it. How are you going to change that?
Sure. I mean, there are a number of things that we're doing, but as a grassroots organization, we are actively talking to folks who ride the subway and bus. But I want to also add sort of on to Alec's point is that we really live in sort of a multimodal city. And when we talk about sort of the differences between the different constituencies of subway riders, bus riders, drivers, There is actually a lot more intersection than what we want to realize. And that goes sort of also to the point that a lot of folks who are living in the outer boroughs are making decisions on a daily basis about whether or not they want to get in their car, which frankly is expensive with costs of insurance, maintenance, gas, versus being able to take a subway or bus into the city or wherever it is that they're traveling. They're making that decision because the options for mass transit are simply not as accessible and not as great as they are in more dense and populated areas of the city, closer to Manhattan. So all of that is to say is what we're really interested in doing is educating the population, subway and bus riders, drivers as well, who sometimes are dependent on mass transit. We really believe that that's sort of the first step in letting all of our constituencies know, because they are the ones who will be demanding their elected officials to take a stance.
Structural question, how come we have to get all these ducks in a row to raise tolls, but the MTA can raise fares without the approval of the state Senate or the Assembly? What is that a product of?
Essentially, right now, they have authority under their charter, if you will, to basically manage the tolling and fare rates of those that they control, right? So for the subways, the buses, commuter rail, and the bridges that they control. So they've got the authority to make those changes. I think they do have to get approval from their board when they're making a proposed increase, which they do, by the way, 4% at least every 2 years. But we're now talking about proposing tolls on facilities that aren't currently tolled, 60th Street and the East River bridges. Therefore, we have to get approval from the state legislature. If I could just quickly also respond to, because Alec raised a lot of very important points. First of all, the AAA is really one of the ones that enlightened us 4 years ago to the fact that the federal sources of transportation funding are drying up, have really dried up. And I think the AAA, one of the reasons they are a little bit more amenable to something like this is because, so they've told me, is because there really aren't a lot of other funding options for maintaining our roads and bridges. And so we've got to do something, and this at least seems like a fair way to do it. No one, listen, I live in Brooklyn. I'm going to have to pay this toll if we're successful here, and I'm going to curse myself every time I do it. But nonetheless, I think this is a fair proposal. And also, to Alec's earlier point, not only are people multimodal, but drivers I talk to who are thoughtful about this and kind of think about this realize that the better the transit system is, the less crowded the roads are that they're using. So it's in their interest to a certain extent to have a well-funded transit system.
Well, thank you very much for coming, guys. You've given us a lot to think about next time we're stuck on the L train or in traffic on the Verrazano. Come back again when the plan moves on, and hopefully we can talk more about it.